On behalf of the Hamad bin Khalifa University College of Law, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural Georgetown University in Qatar HBKU lecture series on the foundations of international thought, and to especially welcome our distinguished speaker from the United States, Professor Richard Steinberg of UCLA Law School, but also who is a visiting professor at Hamad bin Khalifa University College of Law. This series is the brainchild of GUQ Associate Professor and Faculty Chairperson, Dr. Edward Kolla, and HBKU Law Associate Professor and Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, Dr. George Dimitropoulos. At the outset, I'd like to thank them for their vision, to thank them for establishing the series, and of course, for their help in organizing today's event. I'd also like to thank my colleague, Sandy Amanis, who has worked tirelessly with her colleagues here at Georgetown in putting it together. I would like to thank the Dean of Georgetown University in Qatar, Dr. Safwan Masri, along with the Dean's Office, the Communications and Events team, with a special thanks to Pia Pelotonen. Both Professor Kolla and Professor Dimitropoulos recognize the need for an interdisciplinary approach to contemporary international problems and developments, an approach that is grounded in both international relations as well as international law. GUQ and HBKU are part of the Qatar Foundation, and in the foundation, we are members of an ecosystem, as it's described by QF. And as such, we are dedicated to the concept of multiversity. I consider multiversity a concept in which we pull down silos and we work together to promote understanding. Cooperation exemplifies the value of learning from experts in other disciplines. The launch of the GUQ HBKU lecture series on the foundations of international thought is one of the many ways that GUQ and HBKU Law have worked together. For example, for a number of years, HBKU Law faculty professor Ilias Bentikis and Professor Eleni Polymenopoulos have been teaching human rights at GUQ. Further, we now have Professor Kolla co-teaching in the SJD program, Advanced Research Methods in Law. Professor Dimitropoulos co-teaching at GUQ, Advanced Readings in International Thought. And we're really excited about the possibility of our HBKU SJD students participating in some of the undergraduate courses here at Georgetown University in Qatar. So with that, let us continue to learn from each other, and to do so in this amazing environment, this academic educational environment of Georgetown University in Qatar, next to HBKU Law and in beautiful Qatar Foundation and Education City. To help with today's launch, I will now turn the floor over to my colleague, Professor George Dimitropoulos, an expert in international trade and investment law, administrative law, and law and technology, to introduce our distinguished speaker, UCLA professor and HBKU Law visiting professor Richard Steinberg, who will speak about the rise and decline of a liberal international order. He will also introduce us to Professor Kolla. So thank you so much again, Eddie, for all your hospitality and your hard work, and we look forward to a wonderful session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean. Welcome, everybody. It's a great pleasure to have you all here with us today. My role will be short. My job for today is to introduce our wonderful speaker, Professor Richard Steinberg, as well as obviously my colleague, commentator, Professor Kolla. So without further ado, Professor Richard Steinberg is the Jonathan D. Varat Endowed Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science at UCLA. And he holds degrees in law and political science from Yale as well as Stanford. And Professor Steinberg is really an authority in the areas of international law as well as international relations, obviously with the focus on international economic law as well as international criminal law as well as human rights. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a member of the United States Trade Representatives Trade and Environment Policy Advisory Committee, the chair of the International Trade Law Committee of the American branch of the International Law Association, as well as the Director of Trade Policy Research at the Berkeley Roundtable on the International Economy at the UC Berkeley. Now, before joining UCLA, Professor Steinberg worked with the USTR, the United States Trade Representative. Namely, he was an assistant general counsel there. And he has taught in international law courses in many countries around the world. In fact, I should say on 6 continents, right? And above all, and most importantly, at HBKU College of Law here in Doha. In fact, he's been, in a way, if I should say so, if there is such a thing, a permanent visiting professor with the College of Law in the last 6 years or so. It's the 6th visit of Richard, in the last 6 years, and we're grateful to him for that. Thank you so much, Richard. And Professor Kolla, my colleague here from Georgetown University, Qatar, is Associate Professor of History, as well as the Faculty Chairperson at Georgetown University, Qatar. And he holds degrees from Johns Hopkins University, as well as the University of Toronto. He's a historian, but also an international lawyer. He studies the history of international law. He's written this wonderful book on sovereignty, international law, and the French Revolution. The ones of you that have not read it, they should. It's a wonderful book, and this is how we actually met. In fact, I was really eager to get that book in my hands, and when I got it, I realized, that's my colleague here, across the street at Georgetown. And this is how we established the connection a couple of years ago. And his next project, in fact, is an equally interesting project on the history of passports. So, right, I guess I'd leave it at this. Thank you so much. Professor Steinberg will be giving today's talk, and Professor Kolla will be commenting. Thank you. The floor is yours, Richard.
Thank you, George and Susan, for the gracious and kind introduction. It's an honor to be here. It's a pleasure to see some of my current students and some of my former students. So thank you all for coming. Since this is a lecture in the context of the Foundations of International Thought, my thinking is that I will start by trying to situate this in one of the Foundations of International Thought. This talk that I'm going to give is in the realist tradition, right? This is an old, a deeply pedigreed tradition, running back to Thucydides, through Machiavelli, to several contemporary thinkers, and sort of revived by Morgenthau, Hans Morgenthau, during the World War II period. And realism has various forms, but what's common to those forms is the centrality of state power and interests in calculations about the international system. There's a version of it, of realism, that posits that the structure of the international system, whether there's a single power, whether it's imperial or hegemonic, or two great powers, bipolar, or many powers, multipolar, influences the structure of the order of the system. And this is loosely in that tradition. There's also an observation by realists and historians like Paul Kennedy that there are cycles that, I'll start with sort of a cataclysmic war, a big war. And out of the ashes of that war rises a great power, and they tend to dominate the system for some amount of time. Power then disperses in the system, so it goes from a structure that is largely hegemonic to one that is ultimately multipolar, and that creates disorder, yielding another great war. So the Habsburgs in the 16th and 17th century, France in the 17th and early 18th century, Britain in the 19th century, and as I will suggest, the United States in the 20th. So people use the term liberal international order, I think, relatively loosely, because there are many liberal international orders over time, and they vary across 3 dimensions, each associated with one of those words. How liberal are they, right? So there's classical liberalism of the Brits in the 19th century. Liberalism is an ideology and an organizing principle and a political philosophy with roots in the Enlightenment that are based on liberty, consent of the governed, and equality before the law. Politically, they manifest in an ideal typical form as democracy and human rights at the political side, civil and political rights of individuals and groups in particular, and on the economic side, laissez-faire capitalism, free movement of goods and now services. That's liberal trade, liberal capital flows, liberal movement of people. That is, however, ideal typical. That's one end of the spectrum. There are other versions of liberalism. How liberal is the system? The second question is, how international is it? That's a spatial question. Is it global or is it regional? Or even something more complicated like plurilateral. And how is it ordered? It can be ordered through power, through an imperial structure in which one can think of Louis XIV's conquests in the War of the Spanish Succession, sort of directly governing territories. It can be, in the case of the contemporary order that is now in decline, rules-based and institutionally based, but still a sort of a governance structure of rules that are driven by a particular power, or it can be sort of somewhere in between, right? So the British, of course, would have a governor appointed and then have a bureaucratic structure frequently that was similar to the bureaucratic structure in London. So I framed this as a liberal international order that is in decline, because I actually think that at its peak, we have had two post-war liberal international orders. The first one in the bipolar period of US and Soviet competition, right? So how international was that? That was not a global order, right? In the West, there was a particular Western order characterized by institutions like NATO on the military side, GATT, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. And the Eastern Bloc had the Warsaw Pact on the military side and Comecon on the economic side. How liberal was it? It was not classically liberal. It was a version of liberalism in which was embedded in a sort of post-war U.S.-European social contract, right? Money, in classical liberalism, money would, there would be free capital flows. In that period, there were no free capital flows. Capital was controlled. There was control on capital. In trade, there were all sorts of exceptions to liberalism. Safeguards measures, subsidies were allowed under the GATT system. We saw very high subsidies in agriculture. Regulations were allowed limiting trade to protect the environment, to protect human health, to protect intellectual property, to protect public morals. There were illiberal and discriminatory procurement practices allowed, and the service sectors, particularly banking and finance, were closed to foreign participation. So it was not a purely liberal order in the classic sense, right? And then the maintenance of the order was established through international organizations, the ones we know, and some degree of legalization. There was, of course, a project that continued from the earlier part of the 20th century and codification of customary law, which was actually mandated in the UN Charter. So there's a lot of rules that developed, but very few international courts and tribunals, that were effective, right? So that HLA Hart could write in the early 1960s that international law was a primitive system of law. There were primary rules, the rules themselves, but no good rules on enforcement, no good rules on legislating new rules. So it was a primitive order. Of course, the order was shifted to what I would call a new liberal order, which is why the title of the talk is The Rise and Decline of a Liberal International Order. And this is the liberal international order that I believe is now in decline. It is, first of all, it goes from a Western liberal international order, a Western order, to a global order truly. So the GATT expands. It was 24 countries in 1948, still less than 100 in 1990. By 2008, it's 160 members, including Russia and China. And the G7 added Russia in 1994. The G20 was created in 1999, including Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the original BRICS. So it becomes a global order. Second, the international organizations persisted, but we got more primary rules. International criminal law became more robust. European human rights law developed. EU competence expanded. The WTO covered a whole host of new issues, but we also got, more importantly, the secondary rules that HLA Hart said was missing from the order. We got adjudication, judicialization. We got the ICTY, we got the ICTR, the International Criminal Court, the WTO appellate body. So it became judicialized. And third, we saw politically what was called the third wave of democratization. Not only did Eastern Europe democratize, but Latin America, which in 1980 was entirely autocratic, run by generals, many of those states under attack by communist insurgencies backed by the Soviet Union. But by the year 1990, every country in Latin America except Cuba was a democracy. So a huge expansion of democracy. Even Russia was briefly a democracy. And of course, it's in this period that the United States tries regime change and tries to backs covertly the Arab Spring, attacks Iraq, Afghanistan, tries to create democracies there, which was extremely challenging, to say the least, and of course failed almost everywhere. Economically, we became hyper liberal. The Washington Consensus emerged, which was a sense that all good things go together: democracy, free trade, rule of law, and the rules started to change. IMF conditionality started to expressly demand that countries have no capital controls. In the WTO, we liberalized globally telecommunications, banking, and insurance. The appellate body in the WTO started constraining those exceptions that made the GATT embedded liberalism, right? So the embeddedness started to wither away. The ability to use countervailing duties shrunk. The agricultural subsidies were reduced by a third by mandate. The use of safeguards measures was effectively eliminated. The use of the environment exception in the WTO was made almost impossible to use. And regulation was reduced in technical barriers and in sanitary and phytosanitary matters. Of course, the entire Comecon bloc, the former Soviet bloc, transitioned from Leontiev's central planning to a version of capitalism. And even China, which in 1978 was 100% state-owned, but in just for this purpose, in 1990 was 65% of the economy was state enterprises, fell in this period to the point where only 35% of the economy was state enterprises. So this is the liberal international order that's now in decline. The third period, which we are in right now, is one where the order is actually fractured and overlapping. We've had an explosion of regionalism and plurilateralism. We have not just the multilateralism in trade of the WTO, but we have China's RCEP. We have the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, USMCA, and a sort of hub and spoke system of trade agreements for the United States, the European Union, and so that's the fracture. But they're overlapping as well. There are countries that are in many of these. Australia is a member of the comprehensive and progressive TPP. It has a free trade agreement with the United States. It's a member of the RCEP with China. It's fractured and overlapping. The international organizations continue to persist, but face a lot more deadlock, right? So the Security Council, it's very hard to get a unanimous vote among the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, of course. There is even some disagreement within the International Monetary Fund about how to proceed. China is a member of the International Monetary Fund. We see primary rules of international law degrading, rules on territory and security, with things like Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's claims in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. We see dejudicialization, right? So that judicialization that was distinctive in that previous period is diminishing, right? So the appellate body of the WTO is, well, be kind to say it's dormant. It's effectively dead. And in the ICC, we see withdrawal of several countries and non-cooperation of the African Union. So that the order has degraded. And then economically, in terms of how liberal it is, the liberalism is curtailed, capital controls are back, state-led capitalism is back with massive subsidies in China, but also the United States is engaging in state-led capitalism for, it's engaged in technology policy for a long time, supporting the development, research and development, but now it's actually subsidizing production as well through 2 recent statutes in the United States. And then economically also, we see a lot of closure in trade, not just the steel and aluminum under the Trump administration, but with semiconductor chips, with public procurement, now with electric vehicles and batteries. And then politically, we're in a what was called a democratic recession, but that, I think, is generous, right? We've got real backsliding in places like Brazil, Turkey, Hungary, Russia and China are deepening their sort of autocracies. In the United States, of course, we have liberalism under attack. So why is the liberal international order in decline? Why is that liberal international order in decline? That is caused by many things. Part of the story, of course, is the rise of China and the rise of other countries, and that is partly a natural development of what economists call a catch-up theory. And catch-up theory basically says that developing countries are going to have a faster growth rate than developed countries for a host of reasons. But at the same time, the United States has, in particular, done things essentially to itself, a little self-inflicted harm in terms of some of its adventures and some of its activities. Chalmers Johnson has a concept of blowback, and blowback is a term that is originally a military term that comes from the concept that if you throw a hand grenade, you better duck because it's going to blow back at you, okay? Well, we are seeing a lot of blowback. We're seeing blowback internationally from these policies of trying to impose certain rules and political forms on the rest of the world, from our military adventures in the Middle East. And we're seeing a blowback also from this hyperglobalization, right? From moving away from the embeddedness, where in highly developed countries, unskilled and semi-skilled labor have lost a lot of jobs to unskilled and semi-skilled workers in the developing world, which can do the job a lot more cheaply. We also have free riders, right? So the United States has spent an enormous sum of money on defense, protecting countries that spend far less on their own defense than we spend on defense. There is also other models of economic growth that have a much greater proportion of state involvement. So to illustrate this decline, this is a graph of the proportion of GATT WTO GDP of each of the biggest economies in the world. And I'm going to illustrate this with the GATT, but this is a metaphor, I believe, for what's going on. So the blue lines at the bottom, that's the US share of GATT WTO GDP. In 1948, the United States had about 75% of effectively global GDP. Europe was bombed out. The developing world was a tiny fraction. Asia was a tiny fraction. We were completely dominant, right? So we're the biggest market in the world. Gives us enormous bargaining power in negotiations. So the GATT was written in Washington, D.C. It wasn't much of a negotiation. There were discussions with the Brits and a few concessions to the Brits, but for the most part, the U.S. said, if you want access to 70% of the global economy, sign here. So that was imposed effectively on the rest of the world. You can see, though, the U.S. market share is in almost linear decline. The European Union is formed in 1957 for a whole host of reasons. It takes to about the early 1970s when they assert themselves in negotiations. And at that point, the GATT is run by the United States and Europe. Nothing gets done without that duopoly. Probably the height of that is the conclusion of the Uruguay round and establishment of the World Trade Organization. That was done, the WTO agreements include within them several agreements and several provisions the developing world said they'd never sign on to. So, for example, TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property, right? That was seen as a rent grab by the United States, Europe, and Japan, which at the time held 95% of global patents, right? They said they'd never sign. The General Agreement on Trade and Services opened up developing country banking and telecommunications sectors. The developing world said they'd never sign. Why did they? They did because the United States and the European Union, Japan and Canada, withdrew from the GATT 1947, eliminating all of their obligations to keep their market open to the rest of the world, and instead said, we're assigning an agreement which is verbatim identical in terms of obligations, but legally distinct. In other words, in order to have access to our markets, which the US and Europe combined were about 65% of the global economy, in order to have access to our markets, you have to sign here. And by the way, you also have to sign the TRIPS agreement, the GATS agreement, right? It was imposed. That hyper-liberal order was imposed on the developing world. There aren't too many developing country ambassadors who said, oh, we would have voluntarily signed this. Then what happens starting in the year 2000, you see that yellow block there. That represents China's share GATT-WTO GDP. This only goes to 2016. I'm actually updating this. But, and then the light blue line is Russia. One of the light blue lines is Russia. The other one is Brazil. Basically, they said never again, right? We aren't going to be coerced anymore, and they have operated as a bloc. That has made the WTO impossible to govern because their interests and the interests of the global north run orthogonal to each other, right? So we go from, well, the Doha round. The Doha round was a failure, right? And it was the last effort at a trade round. Previously, 8 rounds were a success when either the US was running the system or there was this hegemonic duopoly with the Europeans, right? And now it's deadlocked. And that is a metaphor, I believe, for what is going on. So if you see that growth in the Chinese economy, you also see a growth in Chinese defense spending that is geometrically progressed. So China's military is not only the world's biggest standing army by far, has more tanks than the US, has a space force on parity with the United States, but has the biggest and newest navy in the world. And they are all located around China, while the US forces are dispersed around the world, right? So we have 600 military bases in 80 countries. We have obligations to protect Taiwan, the Philippines, South Korea, Australia, and other countries in East Asia. We have obligations to protect all of Europe. We have obligations to protect Israel, right? So we have to use those forces, and they're spread thin. They're spread thin. We took on those obligations, way back when that blue line was up in the 60s or 70%, right? So we are, like the little Dutch boy trying to plug all the holes in the dike, and the order is under challenge. As a result, China is challenging it, trying to assert hegemony in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, trying to reassert control over Taiwan, and Russia, of course, has tested Western resolve and is trying to expand into Ukraine at this point. Both China and Russia are revisionist powers, right? Whereas the United States and the European Union and Japan are status quo powers. We want the order, that is, the United States, Europe, and Japan want the order to stay as it is, whereas Russia and China are challenging the order really at this point on almost all fronts. So this sort of summarizes the argument. I won't go through it again, but basically the structure of power has shifted, and an order whereat some people have called that point of the fall of the Soviet Union in 1990 a unipolar moment. That certainly, well, first of all, it never existed. It was always a hegemonic duopoly with the European Union. But that was a moment in history. It was a moment in history that Francis Fukuyama famously said was the end of history. That book turned out to be wrong. So what are the consequences of this? I'm going to start at the bottom. It's a thinner global order. Multilateral cooperation is a lot harder. There's no hegemon or hegemonic duopoly of like-minded powers that are capable of driving each of these institutions. Instead, most of these institutions have competing powers in them, revisionist and status quo. In the Security Council, we're not going to see any more UN Security Council Resolution 678 authorizing essentially the invasion of Iraq or condemning Iraq. I went through the WTO example. It's ungovernable at this point, and that's not going to stay. That's not going to change. So what is possible? What is possible are spheres of influence. U.S.-centered and Chinese-centered arrangements, European-centered arrangements, and then these thick regional and plurilateral agreements that are overlapping. And the content of those is very likely to change. Liberalism is going to have to be re-embedded for it to be politically acceptable in the United States and in Europe. We're going to have to see diminished U.S. commitments abroad. We haven't really seen that yet. We have, the United States has this overstretch problem. And I believe we'll also have to see diminished attention to democratization and human rights. That's something that a hegemon can afford to do. A hegemon can afford to have to spend treasure and blood on ideological commitments like human rights. In a multipolar system, it's much harder to do that. You've got to basically take it as you see it and form alliances with whichever countries you can. The United States, which has tolerated free riding over the decades, is less willing to do that now. So that's my talk, and I'm looking forward to Eddie's comments.
Thank you so much, Richard. It's a sign of how much I enjoyed your talk and how much I was stimulated by it that I spent the whole time scribbling notes on my pre-prepared notes. But I also briefly like to thank George and Susan for all of the reasons that you already mentioned, that it's just great to be collaborating between the HBKU College of Law and Georgetown in the ways that we are. In fact, George and I got the sort of idea for this lecture series from a one-off event in January of 2020, where we hosted a colloquium between HBKU College of Law and Georgetown, in which a speaker, David Grewal, who was one of George's mentors, spoke about law and political economy. At the time I said, and I quote, "Personally and selfishly, I hope these sorts of connections with more law colleagues across EC and Doha become a more common occurrence," and this, I think, is proof that that has happened. I was very happy in your presentation, Richard, to hear you talk about the history, go all the way back to the Habsburgs, because my comments today are coming, obviously, from the perspective of a historian. And I have three main comments. The first is a context shift. The second is a critique, and the third is a question. I'm taking issue not with things that I think Richard explicitly has said, but rather some of the underlying assumptions or the foundations of the way he views the world. And so I hope it won't sound like I'm putting words in your mouth, because I do agree with you about a lot of what you're saying. First of all, I think it bears remarking the huge timeliness of a lot of these topics. In fact, I think a lot of them are even more timely today than when you started working on this project back. You said you haven't updated that table since 2016. Because my three comments today are all linked to headlines that I read in newspapers yesterday. And I'm going to use these headlines both to show this timelessness, but also develop my three: first, the context shift; second, the critique; and third, the question. So here's the first headline from yesterday. Xi Jinping says China is ready to stand guard over the world order on Moscow visit. Now, if you want any more proof of what George has been saying about a shift in the liberal international order, a shift to a multipolar world order where China is exerting its influence, well, there's nothing better than this. I would say he may even be underselling the rise of China's role, and that Xi is overselling what he's claiming about being the guardian of a world order. But, students in the room, academics tend to undersell and nuance things, whereas world leaders, they oversell. Now, this, however, begs the question, what world order are we talking about here? It's certainly not that liberal international order, the rise and decline of which Richard has been talking about. Why would China want to defend that order? As we just heard in that great graph that Richard showed, in 1948, 75% of GDP as a ratio of GATT, World Trade Organization, was the US share. IMF quota share in that same, 1 year earlier, 1947, was 42%. Now, Richard is totally right to highlight the precipitous, if relative, American economic decline in the years since then as Europe rebuilt after World War II. He mentions that. Much of the global South industrializes. I think that's much more important. So rather than focus here on that decline, and that decline in not just US power, wealth, and military hegemony, I kind of want to flip the story. Because I think that this moment we're talking about here is actually rather unique in history, in world history. And so to take a larger perspective, to take a larger context, we see precisely how unique this moment was and precisely how strange, wacky, in fact, US hegemony in the past several years has been. I'll start with one small Canadian example, and then I'll move on to my big one. I remember when I was in university and I heard that Canada had the largest navy in the world in 1945. Like, Canada, like, we're a tiny country. I mean, we're a big country, a small country in terms of population, wealth. But again, it was this function of the massive destruction of those, up until this point, European great powers that really left the United States in this very unique role. But I'm shifting, because I'm a history professor, the perspective even a little bit further backwards. And I'm using, as an example, this book, Sven Beckert's Empire of Cotton. Textiles were some of the most important commodities for much of world history. Think about it. What do you need for survival? After you eat, well, you need things to protect you from the elements, including clothing. And for much of human history, far and away, the most important cotton and then textile production centers were in Asia. I mean, South Asia, first of all. Then when China's population doubled in the 18th century, its cotton industry rose to be the second largest in the world, behind India, with 1.2 billion pounds of cotton produced in 1750. That's roughly equivalent to what the US produced a century later, when it was really ramping up production in the run-up to the US Civil War. So what happened in those 100 years? Beckert describes a system in which, first, the fluke of industrialization in Northwestern Europe in the late 18th century, and second, the exploitative practices of the British Raj, allowed for this unprecedented rise in the wealth of the West, which previously historians have called, the Great Divergence, these ideas about, the economic takeoff of the Industrial Revolution that was based on, whatever you want to call it, European ingenuity, industrial capacity, whatever. Now, Beckert disagrees. This isn't Beckert's quote itself. It's from a really good website I found about economic history and comparative development. Beckert attributes this rise in wealth to the West to what he calls war capitalism, the violent exploitation of the non-West through piracy, enslavement, theft of natural resources, and the physical seizure of markets. It was not caused by superior technology or organization or just brains, nor did it rest on, quote, offering superior goods at good prices that you will find in, I like this line, La La Land of economics textbooks, but on the military subjugation of competitors and coercive European mercantile practices in many regions of the world. Now, as our students know from the class we're teaching this term, the shift from those mercantile practices to a world predicated on free trade also advantaged the European states that were then advocating that a couple of centuries later. But I don't have time to get into that in my talk today. What is my point, therefore, in this talk today? US hegemony after World War II was a quirk of circumstance, again, because of the vast destruction of Europe. But much more importantly, so was Western economic hegemony over much of the world. Beckert says this explicitly. In 1860, the role of Britain in the global economy, based on this empire of cotton, he says, was nearly as unimaginable for the future as it was for the past, aka the appearance of Britain as this world power, this world economic power based on war capitalism, was going to be as shocking in its appearance in 1860 as it was going to be for its dominance for the next 100 years, and then for, now wait for it, here's a decline, the way it then fell apart in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. He has a great anecdote about how the Liverpool Cotton Association, once the cotton world's most important trade industry, had to sell its furniture at auction in 1963. Such was the precipitous decline of that economic hegemon. So we could flip this idea of the rise and decline of a liberal international order and instead talk about the decline, brief and then rise of Asian economic hegemony with that brief interruption caused by Western capitalism. And now going back to Xi Jinping, that's the world economic order, or the world order he wants to see returned. And that's, like I said, the first of my 3 points in this shift of perspective if you take this away from the West and really center it on other parts of the world. So my second point, this is my more serious critique, and the headline from The Guardian yesterday that I'm basing it on is, quote, "Global shares tumble after an emergency rescue of Credit Suisse. Are we in a banking crisis?" Now, I haven't had time to check today. I mean, has the global economy totally continued in free fall? Have we all moved our money to gold for our retirements because everything else is in trouble? Again, this shows the timeliness of what Richard is saying, especially because he positions the break between that post-Cold War unipolar moment, that moment when we thought we were at the end of history, and my favorite line from the chapter that you sent was, "The end of history was short-lived." So he points to the 2006 Great Recession triggered by the banking crisis at that time as this key moment. And this is where I disagree. If I had to pick a moment when that post-war liberal order was most damaged, when widespread delegitimization, dejudicialization began among all the others, I'd pick one. Well, let me rephrase this. Just now, Richard was talking about American overstretch, about all the obligations America has in the world with security guarantees in Taiwan, in South Korea, in Japan, in Israel, in Europe with NATO. So why would a country that's got all of that going on decide in 2003 to invade Iraq? Now, I didn't put up the headline from The Guardian, as you may have noticed, because I think there's an even more important headline here that captures this point, also from the last 2 days. Now, Richard totally acknowledged that, what the United States tried to do in terms of regime change was extremely challenging and failed. But I think that's not taking it far enough. This idea that the war in Iraq wasn't a mistake, it was a crime. And that's what I think has caused the most damage to the post-war liberal order. Much more so than, and I agree with Richard a lot about this, all the terrible effects of hyper-liberalism in the economic sphere. This rules-based international order and how much of American economic and military power rested on that system was fundamentally, if not utterly destroyed by this war, which much of the world sees not just as a mistake, not just as something that failed, but as a clear crime. It's for that reason that I also think that things that a lot of American liberals like to highlight, like the shock arrival of Donald Trump on the scene, as undermining the moral force of American foreign policy, is very much overstated. Now, I'm not any lover or apologist for Trump, but my point would be that many people in many parts of the world, long before the arrival of Trump, and many of them even before the war in Iraq, really didn't think there was much moral force in American foreign policy. I have another fun Canadian historical anecdote. But first, we only have to think back to the war in Iraq to remember when people were dumping French wine down the sink. They were renaming French fries freedom fries to show these splits in the liberal Western alliance at the heart of NATO. So what Trump was doing, I think, was less a brand new thing, but really rather part of a trend, and a longer-term trend in American history. And the Canadian anecdote I'm going to use here, going back to the Vietnam War, is when in 1965, Canadian Prime Minister Lester Pearson visited Camp David and had previously proposed what he called pause for peace, a limited halt to U.S. airstrikes against North Vietnam. And for that crime, LBJ grabbed him when he first saw him, pulled him up by the lapels, and shouted, "Don't you come into my living room and piss on my rug." My point here is that there's a long history of dissatisfaction, not just in the global south, but even within the Western alliance with American foreign policy. And therefore, Trump's not very much anything all that new, and therefore also, any return to a status quo under the Biden administration is not much of a change, again, from the perspective of a lot of people in a lot of parts of the world. Now, my last headline and my last question now for Richard is, does any of this really matter? Here's a headline from The Guardian yesterday: climate crisis scientists deliver final warning, act now or it's too late. My point in raising this question is twofold. Are any of us even really going to be around for much longer? And I'm not just talking about the climate crisis. And here's where my own research intersects most seriously with Richard's. And I couldn't agree more with the very last point he had on his slideshow about how there is now a greater risk of conflict. But I'm very much more pessimistic, I think, about where that risk for conflict takes us. So this book, The Great Leveler, argues that in human history, you really only see true, and I'm talking truly fundamental redistributions of wealth in the aftermath of giant calamities. And not calamities like the stock market crash in 1929, calamities like the European Black Death. And that's really the only moments when you see, again, really fundamental, long-term historical change. And when I first read this book, I got to thinking, that's also kind of true of the international system. This is something I actually teach in my history of international law class without even really knowing it. Now, you mentioned, David, that a long line of realist theory in both history but contemporary international relations theory talks about how, David Kennedy, out of cataclysm rises new great powers. But what I think happens, and this is the next big research project, if I ever finish that book on passports that George mentioned earlier, is to look at how, and my ideas on this are still nebulous and forming, but really wondering, is large-scale change to the international system, I'm talking big-time structural change, is that possible ever in anything other than the aftermath of a systemic conflict, catastrophe, and collapse? And honestly, I don't think so. I've really only identified 3 in about the past 2,000 years of Western history. One's the collapse of the Roman Empire, when we went from a universal political, legal, and economic paradigm and saw its gradual reconfiguration into the current Westphalian state system over about 1,000 years. Now, that Westphalian state system is born in the 30 Years' War in yet another cataclysm, the 30 Years' War, in which roughly 1/3 of the population of Central Europe perished. Now, the most recent cataclysm and change to a state system, or a world order, let's say, is what we've got now, that came out of the First and the Second World Wars, also roughly about 30 years if you go from the beginning of the first to the end of the second. I think historians in the future might be calling that conflict the Second 30 Years' War, and it might have been just as important, because that conflict didn't quite get rid of the Westphalian state system, but it inaugurated this weird hybrid where you have this international order that encompasses, the big international organizations, the League of Nations, which failed but then was revivified in the United Nations, all of the economic systems that Richard talked about in his talk. But that is again, this awkward hybrid between the old state system and a new quasi-international system that's under threat. Now, is that order in decline? Yes. Was Western and US hegemony practically a giant historical fluke that led to that system? Also, probably yes. Does Xi Jinping want to stand guard over that world order or a different kind of world order? Probably a different world order. But, and here's the problem, is it easy to change the world order? If I'm right, no, it's not. And so how do we deal with these two realities? This US system, inaugurated, like I say, after that fluke of the moment of European chaos, the destruction of war capitalism in the rest of the world that led to this very unique moment for US hegemony, and now that system of US hegemony falling apart. Well, how do we get to a new system without, if the history shows us anything, another systemic collapse? That's, I'm sorry to say, a bit of a downer. So I will end on a, I hope, funnier note and with a meme. Now, I also circulated this to my friends this weekend, and it again highlights a couple of the themes from our talk today, hinting at precisely the unique moment of that post-war period, when our parents, my parents, those people who were born lucky enough to be in the baby boom generation, hit the timeline perfectly. They dropped in after a war. They did some stuff in the 60s and 70s that I blocked out there for the purposes of being appropriate. They were able to buy a house for cheap, start a family, retire young, and they get to leave right before the climate crisis kills us all. That's not much of a happier note to end on, but at least I got some laughs, so it was a humorous one. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you again, Richard, for your talk. We're going to have Q&A now, but first I'm going to give Richard the chance to respond to any of my comments if he'd like. If not, we can jump straight into what the audience has to say. Again, thank you very much.
I love those comments because as a realist, I'm usually considered the downer. So let me just respond to these quickly so that we can get to other questions. First of all, I actually don't think there's a lot of light between my position and yours. I think we're really closely in agreement here. I take your first comment about context shift to suggest that what we're seeing is not as much a decline, but partly as a rise. And I don't disagree with that. The decline that I'm talking about is a decline in relative power. The United States has continued to grow since the Second World War. It's that other countries, China in particular, has grown quite enormously, as has Europe, as India is now doing. And part of that story, or a big part of that story, is the catch-up theory that I was referring to, right? It's the idea that developing countries can grow a lot faster than a developed country. There are diminishing marginal returns to investment as a country develops. And that's the micro foundation of this macro observation that the average growth rate of developed countries in the last 30 years has been something like 1%, whereas the average growth rate of developing countries has been closer to 4%. And there's a particular point of growth in development where countries can grow at 10, 12%, which is what China did. Now China's coming back down to a lower rate of growth, and India is hitting that. So India is going to rise. And of course, the United States exacerbated that by things that Eddie talked about in his second point, right? This critique about, first of all, the periodization. I don't want to quibble over periodization, right? I'm just trying to illustrate sort of roughly points in time. I was pointing to an economic problem that created a loss of confidence in the American way economically, but I absolutely have no disagreement that adventures like Iraq led to blowback, right? Characterizing as a crime, the problem is I do international criminal law, and so technically it wasn't a crime. There may have been crimes committed at a relatively small level, but in lay terms, yeah, it was criminal. It was, and it completely, what, 1 million people died for what, I don't disagree that, of course the United States sowed the seeds of that dimension of its decline through, and it started, at the beginning, right? We imposed this order on the world, and we did it in the economic sphere, and we did it in the military sphere, and it's not surprising that it led to resentment and serious pushback. On the question of does it matter, I don't disagree that one possible outcome here, in fact, it might even be a likely outcome, is a calamitous conflict, right? This is the Thucydides trap. This is the problem of a declining power being willing to accommodate a rising power or not. At this point in time, the United States is not showing that it's willing to accommodate, right? I mean, the real, again, my view, and it's a somewhat heretical view in the United States, is that, basically ceding eastern Ukraine to the Russians to just get peace and to stop this meat grinder, right, and to accommodate Russia is not a terrible outcome. Ukraine's not going to win this war without, NATO boots on the ground, and that's a calamity, right? And it probably goes to tactical nuclear weapons at that point. And in Asia, the United States is not only it had this ambiguous position about Taiwan, right? And, what would we come to his defense? How much, and now Biden has taken it one step further that we will defend Taiwan. We are showing no signs of accommodation, and that is very, very worrisome. What that new system looks like, I do think that I think what she would like is the accommodation. I don't think he wants the elimination of the state system. I don't think he wants, an imperial structure run by Beijing, though there's no doubt about it that it is a system that would be run by Beijing and with its authoritarian or extreme authoritarian norms. I don't disagree that it's entirely possible that there's a calamitous war. There are all sorts of possible outcomes, right? So I'll give a third possible outcome. There is a shooting war in East Asia, triggered by Taiwan, it doesn't go nuclear, but one outcome is that the U.S. is defeated. And we quietly have to, not quietly, loudly we have to recede, right? Another possibility is none of us know whose technology is better in cyber attacks or space war, shooting down satellites and the like. It's entirely possible that China gets defeated too. There, in which case the possibility of sort of a longer period of U.S. Assertion in East Asia. So, these aren't predetermined, and I do agree very sadly that we're on track for calamitous conflict.
All right, we're now going to open the floor to Q&A. So if you do have a question you'd like to ask, please signal and someone will bring a microphone over to you. Please, yep.
Hello, once again, thank you for organizing this event. I wanted to ask you about neoliberalism. Like in 2007, the WTO basically admitted China, right, into its organization. Prior to that admittance, there was rhetoric around the United States and the United Kingdom that if China were to liberalize its economy, democracy would come, right? Do you think that the liberal order, the liberal international order, collapsed because of this priority of neoliberalism above that of political democracy? Do you think that the reason why democracy is receding right now is precisely because of that prioritization, that naivete that if you bind everything together, economic liberalism is tied with political liberalism, that it must necessarily therefore happen? Do you think that this is somewhat contributes to that decline? Thank you.
Yeah. I do think it contributed to it. I think that the faith that American policymakers had that China would become just like us. So, there's a very rich theory of political development, right? Seymour Martin Lipset, Samuel Huntington, and there was a faith that if only China could develop, a middle class would rise, stand in opposition to the state, which is a story about the development of democracy in Europe. And there was a faith that that would happen with China. Very few people disagreed with that. I'm proud to say that I was one of them. And wrote about that at the time. But there was sort of a coalition of people who believed in that, and business which wanted opportunities in China, both in Europe and the United States, which therefore championed China's accession to the WTO. And the concerns, China didn't fit in with the WTO, right? So the WTO is a collection was a collection of largely liberal states, right? And in fact, Sylvia Austrie from your alma mater, and who was an economist and a trade negotiator, an ambassador, talked about systems friction. And so, look, some systems just, you can't have a single set of rules that will work with two radically different systems. So yeah, I do think that by admitting China, then that played by most of the rules, but not by the principles of the system, and which crucially, there were no rules on constraining state enterprises in the WTO. That faith is part of the story of the decline of this liberal order.
Yep, next up, there in the center.
Thank you very much indeed. I enjoyed your talk. I just wanted to make the point that a lot of people actually do think that the 2003 invasion of Iraq was a crime of aggression, including myself. And I wanted to ask, I'm not a historian, nor am I a political scientist. And I'm in fact new to academia. I just wanted to ask whether or not the world order that you two kind of presented tonight was in a way kind of situates it, from your perspective. So for instance, when you talked about the obligation of the United States to protect Israel, which is seen as, like a mandate and a responsibility, I believe that to certain people, in a different situation, situated in a different kind of a position, they would think that that is very scary. And likewise, with the rhetoric of, the hegemon being able to afford to use blood to promote human rights, again, I think it triggers a lot of alarms in a lot of people situated in a different position. So I wonder if it is something that, I'm actually with some of the students in the SJD class tonight. We study ethics. I wonder if we could perhaps, ask ourselves, what is our position? From where does our perspective come? Because, I think because I'm new to academia and so are our students. So if I could ask you to perhaps reflect on this, thank you.
Thanks. I'm not. First of all, on the crime of aggression, right? Again, I will resort to the law. Right? There are two legal bases for going to war in this order, at least two. One of them is self-defense, which Iraq was not, and the other is authorization by the UN Security Council, which the Security Council resolution was crafted to constitute an authorization. So it was technically not the crime of aggression. Again, was it criminal in lay terms? I would not dispute that. okay? The U.S. Protection of Israel, there's a path dependence to that, right? So it was born out of a time when the British had essentially, and the UN had created the State of Israel, and there were, attacks on it. It was then reinforced by the fact that Israel was a U.S. ally in the Middle East, and is still reinforced by that realpolitik calculation that we have allies in large part on the west side of the Persian Gulf and Israel. And it was also reinforced, thirdly, by the claim that's been made for a long time that it is the only democracy in the Middle East. With that democracy at least fraying, if not ending, with the Netanyahu government, and with the delegitimation, even in the United States, and even among a majority of non-Orthodox Jews in the United States, so that a majority of non-Orthodox Jews in the United States condemn, actually, in recent polls, condemn Israel for its policies of settlement, a policy of settlement in the West Bank. I think that that third kind of basis for U.S. support of Israel is diminishing. I think we are left with, in terms of supporting Israel, realpolitik, right? I mean, there is, this sort of split in the Middle East is really in bold relief, I think, between sort of the states that are allied effectively with Russia and those that are effectively allied with the United States. I think that will continue to support Israel just because of that realpolitik reason. Support it in the sense of alliance with it. Support, we support Saudi Arabia in the sense that we're allied with it, right? But very frosty relations over normative issues, right? The Khashoggi killing, it's very, very hard in a country like the United States where there is has been generally a sense of liberalism to have warm relations with MBS, right? But we're still allied in a sense because we have to be.
I'd just like to briefly add one point to that. I mean, I think that, and you said at the beginning, that you come from the realist tradition. You reiterated that at the end, and you talked about the centrality of state power and state interests in that tradition. And I think that when you're a hegemon, aside from the other things you were saying hegemons get to do, one I think is perceiving their power and their interests as normal and necessary rather than as, again, historically contingent and choices. And I think that gets kind of at what the point you're making, that these security guarantees that the U.S. has given to, among other states, Israel, are things that the U.S. is choosing to do. And that choice, if it were flipped, it's very hard to see the U.S. agreeing to other states operating in the same way. If the Russians tried to set up a base or even meddle slightly in Canadian politics, imagine the flip of the Ukraine crisis on America's border. And I'm in no way an apologist for Putin, but it's precisely that hegemonic worldview that I think the changing the context helps us see some of the quibbles and concerns that people in other parts of the world notice that a lot of Americans just take for granted.
I don't disagree with that.
All right, yes, Ida.
I apologize, I'm a little nervous, but I really wanted to ask this. So when you were talking about multipolarity, you were saying that that's what's causing instability, kind of like this destruction of the trade. But I was thinking, do you think the only way to maintain international order is through a hegemon or a superpower overpowering all other states? I would like to argue, in my opinion, that it's the opposite. That when there's a hegemon on a superpower above other countries, it's what, that threat is what encourages them to try to gain more power and attack it and create this world of conflict and war. So it's kind of a paradox. So if we don't have the hegemon, there's disorder, but if we have the hegemon, we also have disorder. So what is your opinion on this? Do you think we can reach a certain path that we in between, or do you think we just need a hegemon forever?
That's a great question. There has been a debate about precisely that question for a very long time. The argument, so the counter argument to the idea that hegemony is required to provide order is that even in a multipolar world, cooperation can make all parties better off. And that therefore there is a demand for creating order. There's a demand for certain rules that keep the system coherent, right? So if you look at the hegemonic idea as supplying order, you can look at the multipolarity idea as demanding order, okay? The question is, what kinds of cooperation are possible in a multilateral order? And the answer, I believe, is very limited. So there is a great article, a landmark article written in roughly 1940 by Hans Morgenthau that talks about political international law and non-political international law. And he distinguishes between, and by the way, Marxist legal scholars in the Soviet Union and China have talked about the same thing, and actually used the same language, right? And that he basically argues, and it makes sense, that there is international law which is of a particular form that is political. It's driven by a particular power or maybe a small group of powers. And then there is international law that's just in everyone's interest, right? The Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, the red light on the port side of a ship, so that which is part of maritime law, so that countries know coordination problems, right? But the problem is that so without a hegemon, you end up with what's left over is the non-political international law, but that's a very thin global order, because those are only things that sort of make all countries better off and don't really have a distributive consequence, right? The political international law has a distributive consequence. And it's that distributive consequence that's part of the blowback, right? That, you referred to it as people quibbling over US policy. It's not quibble, it's people are downright angry throughout much of the world about it.
All right, Zachariah, and then Yusufa. And then, yeah. Sorry, Susan, we'll get to you, but I'm prioritizing the students first.
Thank you for your presentation. I was just kind of curious, and similar kind of going back to the point about Iraq and other cases. I want to, in the case of the liberal order, how international was it in the sense that not every state can do what the United States did, for example, which is interpret a clause in the authorization of use of force that says to make Iraq, leave Kuwait, to say that, it hasn't agreed with other conditions, and therefore we have a legal justification to go to war. And this is kind of the crux of my question of how international is this order when, different states can decide when to apply the international rules, they can decide when to enforce it, when not to enforce it, and then it becomes almost an international order of convenience as opposed to international order that is universal for all states. And so I guess that's kind of, you mentioned that there's the global phase of, the international order, and how global was that phase if we consider the events that happened in that specific time frame?
Well, it was global in that most of the states of the world signed up to the main treaties, participated in the main organizations, right? In taking actions within that, of course, there was a wide divergence of capacity to do that. And in complying with the rules, arguably there was divergence, right? And I'll go to the realist bumper sticker. The powerful do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. And it doesn't mean that it's fair. In fact, the nature of hegemony is that it is unfair, right? So if you can imagine rules, non-political international law, that makes everyone better off, there are also rules that make some states better off than others, right? And there are some applications of those rules and divergence of compliance with the rules and issues of who has the authority to interpret the rules that diverge as well. It doesn't mean that it was a fair order, but it was global, it was liberal, and it was an order.
All right, Safa, did you want to go next?
Hi everyone, my name is Safa Jaber. Thank you for this interesting, I would like to call it debate, if it's like looking for things from different perspectives. But I was like really questioning myself as a Palestinian or as one of citizens in the Middle East. Should I be sharing up for this news, or should I be sad? I don't know. I have this kind of, I don't know, I cannot decide my feeling in this. And I want you to guide my feeling here. Should we be sharing up this news, the decline of the US, or should we be happy to the rise of the China? And or we can just neutral, and this is not our business at all. We should have to navigate this conflict and look at our internal conflict. It's not our conflict. This is my question, and I think like your debate just like reflect on our class that we have. It's the equation of winners and losers. In this like equation, we have winners and losers, and I don't know if there's a gap. Is the Middle East states they are part of the winners or the losers, or we are just in the leap, nothing there? And again, the question is where's international law in all this equation? I think the previous question touched upon this. We are going to be realistic and like just ignore the international law and go ahead? Please let me know from now, because I'm doing my PhD in international law. If you don't need it, I have to switch my my dissertation topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Haya. Oh, sorry, Safa.
There we go. Let me just be very clear about one thing, which is that my claims in my talk, what I've been arguing, is not intended to be normative. It's not intended to be a claim that what has happened or what is happening is good or bad. Okay, it just that it is. It's a positive, not a normative analysis. Now, should you, as a Palestinian in the Middle East, be happy about this or not? Right. I would say that as a general, okay, I would say you should be unhappy in one sense, which is that we're likely to, I think, I agree with Eddie, we're in a much more violent, potentially violent situation. And I think, most people don't think that war and violence is a good thing, myself included. So I will stake out a normative stance that in that sense, it's a bad thing. In terms of, however, the second point would be that it puts, that this new rise of China puts the Middle East in a sort of better position than it has been, in the sense that states in the Middle East can start to play China and the United States off each other, which is exactly what Saudi Arabia is doing. I don't, I'm not an expert on the region, but my interpretation of it is that it is in Saudi Arabia's interest to have more stability. It is in Saudi Arabia's interest to have stronger economic ties with China. But more than anything, it's in Saudi Arabia's interest to play China and the United States off each other. The more that, relations have been frosty, right? And the more that it starts to look like Saudi Arabia can tilt towards China, the more the United States is likely to say, we have to warm up relations, right? And for Palestinians who have been effectively, under the thumb of been subject to a hegemony that is backed by the United States, to the extent that Russia and China are, their influence has spread into the region, I would think that could only be a good thing. The third point, however, is be careful what you wish for, because we don't know what the world order will look like. We've gone through many scenarios of what could happen, right? And we don't know what things will look like in 20 or 30 years. So many people around the world, I've been to many conferences where people are, yes, the U.S. is in decline, this is a great thing, that's sort of the reaction to it, but what replaces it, right? I think anyone who thinks Xi Jinping is a hero is naive.
Great. Now, Haya, I couldn't see you before, but yes, please.
So, hi, my name is Haya. I have a question about how technological advancement of the East, like China, would, or whether it have a core role on that decline of the international liberal order that we once have under the lead of the United States, and whether the few, I don't know if you heard the news about how China bring Saudi Arabia and Iran to the table, where it's played the role that the United States used to play, and whether it's already linked to the advancement of technological advancement of China.
Okay, I think I'll take a comment on the second part of that first, right? Which is that China played a role that the United States couldn't play, right? The United States is, in the Middle East, the United States has gotten locked into, to some degree, a sort of the sort of Shia-Sunni split, right? And we're clearly backing one side of the Gulf, and the Russians are pretty clearly backing the other side, and with tentacles in other dimensions of that. But it's a U.S.-Russian face-off, and we couldn't broker that. We couldn't broker that. China could. Okay. In terms of technology, yeah, technology is a piece of it. I actually didn't get to this when I was talking about catch-up theory, that a state can catch up. I only talked about the law of diminishing returns on investment. The other piece of it is what's called second mover advantage in technology, right? The first mover in developing a new technology has to go through a very expensive process of invention, of research and development, right? The second mover doesn't have to pay for that, especially when, especially if they just, I hate this term, but is stealing intellectual property. I hate the term because it's treating intellectual property like it's truly property in the sense of personal property or real property. And so you then could say it's been stolen. In fact, it's a policy choice, right? But the point is that China could, among other things, leapfrog. So an example, two examples. Example one is a PLA-led enterprise of cyber theft of trade secrets of American, Japanese, and European companies. And this is very well known. There was a unit of the People's Liberation Army, a high-rise in Beijing. The hacking would start when they came into the building at 8:30 in the morning. It would stop at noon and resume at 1 p.m. after lunch and continue until 5 o'clock Beijing time, or 7 o'clock Beijing time, whatever it was. So there's theft. The second point is leapfrogging, right? So the United States and Europe, to have telephones, had to lay down, a twisted pair of wire, and then we had to, when we moved to mobile technology, to cell phones, had to then also get those. There are countries all over the world, I've been to parts of Africa. I don't foresee a twisted pair of cable for maybe, I can't even imagine, right, in some of these places. But they all have cell phones, right? So they can leapfrog, which is a much cheaper way to get to a higher level of technology. The question about China is whether after they've leapfrogged, after they've cyber stolen intellectual property, whether they can invent the cutting edge stuff in the highest levels of technology, whether that system is as good at that as a largely laissez-faire system. And I'm agnostic on that, and there are huge debates about it.
I think we have time for one last question. Mohammed?
Hi, thank you for the great talk. And my question, I'd say divide into two parts. The first one would be a follow-up on the technology question. We hear now about how countries, entities are storing vast amounts of encrypted data in the anticipation of quantum computing coming, and then all of these data, whether it's trade secrets or military information, sensitive information, can be decrypted in a matter of minutes. Now, there are some mechanisms or, let's say, endeavors in order to try and prevent this. Cryptographers are trying to come up with new ways to prevent this from happening, etc. But where are the role of international mechanisms in preventing this sort of disastrous, let's say, mass decryption of information once the technology becomes available? The follow-up to that is, let's say, a broader question, but it's something that was provoked when Professor Kolla brought up that last headline of, well, does it even matter? Does it even matter with climate change? And I'm asking that in the context of the best science is there. The solutions have been laid out. The steps in order to avert this specific calamity of climate change is well studied, well researched. There are a lot of technologies available in this current time in order to prevent at least or mitigate the worst effects of it. However, the mechanisms to implement those lie in instruments of international law. Now, does this fall of the liberal order invalidate those instruments to the point of whatever order that may come next, hegemony, liberal, whatever? Can it pick those up and apply those solutions? In a weird way, I guess I'm asking, what happens next? Are we just destined to wait for the calamity, or can those instruments save us? Sorry for the bummer question.
Okay, so the race to de-encrypt all that data is just that it's a race, and right now the leaders in the race are competing with each other over it, and cooperation on it seems to me to be very, very unlikely. Both sides want to garner advantage. Both sides, I think, believe they have a shot at winning that race. And whoever actually does win that technological race or starts to take the lead is not likely to agree to stop. Okay, so it's a game that doesn't seem to have a solution. Climate change, yeah, we're on a path to incinerate ourselves. Even if Europe and the United States are able to reduce carbon emissions radically, and the United States has taken great strides in just the last year in terms of policy to reduce our carbon emissions, as long as India and China spew out at the rates they are, that approach is pretty hopeless. What my friends who are really spent their lives, their careers focusing on this, are saying, and I have a friend who's a climate scientist at one of the national labs in the U.S., and I could go on and on about their credentials. They're now saying that the most likely way out of this is geoengineering, which has been seen as fanciful or scary, right? There's a lot of opposition. Oh my gosh, if we spray these chemicals into the atmosphere, there could be unknown consequences. But they are of the view that it's a very cheap solution. That, as one friend put it, if you have 100, all you need to do is put 100 jets in the air at all times, spraying certain chemicals, and that will actually bring down the Earth's temperature. The problem with it, though, is an international coordination problem. You need cooperation coordination. Why? Because some countries are going to look at it and say, gee, it's cheap to do, right? It's actually cheap to do that. And some of the countries that can afford to do that might say, gee, the optimal temperature for our location in the world is X, and it might be a temperature that's catastrophic for certain other regions of the globe. So it has the potential to solve, the big problem of incinerating ourselves, but it also has the potential to sort of overcool parts of the world and to become another source of conflict.
All right. Well, thank you again, Richard, so much for your talk tonight. Thank you all for coming.